Good morning and welcome to our second session of legal research for public librarians or non-law librarians rather that we talked about yesterday. I just have one quick announcement before we pass it off to Deb. Yesterday Deb mentioned some great resources, websites and databases that had some good legal information, and I just wanted to make a note that I did confirm with the Wild staff that the Gale Legal Forms database effective July 1st will be going away. The Wild Consortium has chosen not to renew that subscription. I do understand some libraries will be picking it up on their own. I don't know which of those are, but if you have any questions or concern, you'll want to talk to your Wild representative in your library. So with that, we are going to go ahead and pass it off to Deborah Person, Associate Law Librarian at the University of Wyoming Law Library. And today's session is on courts and case law.
Thank you, Sarah. Say hello to everybody. And as Sarah said, we're going to be dealing with legal resources for courts and case law today. So since this session has a lot of information in it, I thought we'd just jump right in and have a little review of a general court system. The court system in general has a trial court level, and the next level of the court system would be an intermediate appellate court level, which hears appeals. We're going to talk about all of these in a little more depth in a minute. And then the final level of a court system is a court of last resort. We tend to call this the Supreme Court, but it's not called the Supreme Court in all jurisdictions. So let's go on and talk about each of these. The trial courts are the courts that you see on TV when you're watching law shows. It's the first court in a jurisdiction to hear a case. And in the trial courts, you've got a judge or jury, or judge and jury present. You've got defendant and plaintiff, or in criminal cases, a defendant and a prosecutor. This is where your evidence is presented, your witnesses are heard, and in the end, an order or a sentence is handed down. And it's important to note that whatever results of the court, of this particular court process in a court case, those are not published. They're not widely available. If anybody wants the results of a particular trial, they have to go directly to the court. And when they do that, they're going to be asked for the name of the case or docket number or some information so that the court information can be retrieved. But they are public record. Most of the information is public record. Intermediate appellate courts are actually the first level of appeals. So once you go through the trial process, you have a right to an appeal, and it goes then to the intermediate appellate court. At the appellate courts, you're dealing with legal briefs, and briefs are legal arguments, written legal arguments in support of whatever issues are being appealed. So the briefs are written and they're submitted to the judge or judges. It can be a bank of judges. At that point, the judges decide whether they want to decide based on just the briefs or whether it's important to them to hear oral arguments. When they hear oral arguments, then the legal representatives of each opposing side is going to be present. The appellant is the side that is appealing, and the appellee is the side that is responding to the appeal. Usually at an appellate level, you don't have the parties present, the parties who are involved. They can be present as far as I know, but they don't necessarily appear at appellate court hearings. The decisions of appellate courts are then published as case law. And then our court of last resort is really just a next level of appellate court, but it is the final level of appellate review. Like I said, we tend to think of it as being called the Supreme Court, and in many jurisdictions it is, but not in all jurisdictions. These courts handle the appeals from the appellate court, the intermediate appellate court, and they handle it in a very similar fashion with briefs and oral arguments. And the decision from the court of last resort in a jurisdiction is final for that jurisdiction. So I want to talk about the Wyoming court system, and you'll notice right away that we're not following the model that I set up as an initial court system. We have what we might consider to be two trial courts. In effect, though, the Wyoming Circuit Court is a court of limited jurisdiction, and that means they can only hear certain issues. They hear at the criminal level, they are hearing misdemeanors only. And remember yesterday we spent some time talking about trying to make a distinction between criminal and civil issues so that it becomes pretty natural to you when an issue comes up in front of you. So the Circuit Court, Wyoming Circuit Court, is handling the trials for criminal misdemeanors and for civil issues for which the remedy is under $7,000. The Wyoming District Court is a court actually of broader jurisdiction. It handles all issues, including criminal felonies and civil issues that will result in an award of more than $7,000. I'm calling these both trial courts because they both have trial court jurisdiction. However, the Wyoming District Court also serves as an appellate court for cases coming out of the Wyoming Circuit Court for those people who choose to appeal. It's not considered an intermediate appellate court because it's not handling only appeals, but it does hear appeals, and that's important to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out what kind of documents somebody needs to file. So in Wyoming then, our only true appellate court is indeed our court of highest resort, or last resort, and that's the Wyoming Supreme Court. This is important to remember because only decisions from the appellate courts are published as case law, and therefore only decisions from Wyoming Supreme Courts are going to be available in the resources that you'll be looking at. In the federal court system, you know what, let me go back to this page for just a minute, because I didn't include some of the other courts in the Wyoming court system here, and I have a link that I thought might be helpful to you. As this page comes up, it also has some public records, but it has court information about what each of these courts hear. And I did not address municipal courts or drug courts, some other of the smaller courts with limited jurisdiction. But I like this little chart down here that directs people to subject matter and where those kinds of issues are going to be heard in the Wyoming court systems. Just wanted to point that out to you before I go further into the federal courts. Now, the federal courts follow the model that I had presented before. With the trial court level, the trial courts for the federal court is the federal district court, and of course in Wyoming, it's the federal district court for the District of Wyoming. Every state has at least one federal district court, and some states with a larger population will have several different branches of the federal district court for their state. The intermediate appellate courts at the federal level are known as the circuit courts of appeal. There are 13 circuits, 12 circuits plus one federal circuit, and the Wyoming federal appeals cases are heard in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. We keep that in mind as we go forward because that's going to help us in assessing the case law that we encounter. And then, of course, our court of last resort and final appeal is the United States Supreme Court. So when we talk about case law, we're talking about the published decisions of the courts. Courts are compelled to follow their earlier decisions and decisions of the courts above them within their jurisdiction through the legal theories of stare decisis and precedents. And when I say courts within their jurisdiction, we have the federal court system, which is its own jurisdiction, and we have the state court systems, each of them being their own jurisdiction. And I'm speaking in general terms. I'll split that out a little bit later. But it's important to notice that the courts within your jurisdiction, those decisions from the higher courts, bind your court. And the reason is that we want, in all fairness, to find the same way for everybody as long as the facts of their case is the same. And so that's why we try to follow these legal theories in order to make everything equal. And now, courts, however, are not bound to follow the decisions of courts outside their jurisdiction. That's what we call persuasive precedents. So if you think in terms of our state courts and our federal courts, let's just play this out a little bit. State courts do not have to follow the decisions of other state courts. Wyoming Supreme Court is interpreting Wyoming law. Colorado courts are interpreting Colorado law, and we're not bound by any of the decisions, obviously, that Colorado makes. State courts don't have to follow federal court decisions. That is, the federal court is a different jurisdiction, and the federal court is interpreting federal law, as opposed to Wyoming State Court, which is interpreting Wyoming law. Federal courts in one circuit don't have to follow decisions of federal courts in another circuit. If both the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in the federal system and the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals in the federal system hear a case on the same legal issue and they decide it differently, that actually means that across the country we have different laws, because if it's followed on the interpretation of the court, each of those regions are following their own court's interpretations. Until that goes up to the United States Supreme Court, if it is appealed to the United States Supreme Court, and if they decide to hear the case and then publish a decision based on that issue, and they publish it, then everybody in all the federal courts are bound by that decision. But until it gets to the United States Supreme Court, they're actually dealing with different jurisdictions at that point. So just once again, muddying the waters, but it's important to keep in mind, because that's how you see, as you encounter cases, you'll see that the different circuits do come up with different interpretations of the same federal laws. Let's talk about where we're going to find cases. We're going to find case law in paper, predominantly, my first sections, and we'll look at online sources later, but in paper, we're looking at reporters. I want to look at a couple of paper resources, just talk about them actually, because it will help us to some degree to interpret the case citations that we're seeing, and so I think it might be important to you to kind of visualize. Reporters are the published volumes of case law for a jurisdiction. Many jurisdictions have their own sets of reporters. Some jurisdictions are combined into other sets, and we'll talk about those sets. The reporters are arranged chronologically as the decisions are written. So this is, like many other legal materials, a chronological arrangement for what you're seeking. The paper volumes are updated with slip opinions or advance sheets, little paperback, softbound volumes that accompany or come after the reporters until there are enough decisions to actually publish a whole new volume. The digests are the tools that we use to access court decisions as keyword access or as subject access. So we're going to look at a couple of those, and of course we'll look at online searching as well. When we go into the federal courts, let's take a look at the reporters which publish federal court decisions. The federal district court is the federal trial court level, as we said. And those decisions for the federal district court are published in a set called the Federal Supplement. That is abbreviated as FSUP or FSUP2. I want to bring to your attention that it's kind of easy to recognize federal cases because they're going to have an F in front of them. Okay. The second that's referring to here is telling us that it's a second series for the Federal Supplement, which really is only an arbitrary publisher decision once they have volume numbers numbering up to a certain number, and it's not always the same number. Usually it's 999, but not always. They'll just say, that's enough of this series, we're going to start renumbering, and then they'll throw it into a new series. It doesn't matter to us except to note that those numbers, second or third, those are all important to our citation for case law, so we need to be aware of them. The decisions from the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeal are published in the Federal Reporter, and those are abbreviated F2nd, and F3rd. The United States Supreme Court decisions are published in 3 different sets: the United States Reports, which is abbreviated US Supreme Court Reporter, which is abbreviated SCT, and then the Lawyer's Edition, LED. You can pretty much count on all of the decisions from the United States Supreme Court being published. Most of the decisions from the Federal Circuit Courts of Appeal are published, but at the Federal District Court level, that is the trial courts, only some of those cases are published. And so you're not anywhere going to find a full collection of those resources. But they do a pretty good job of putting those out for researchers, a pretty good job of making them available. The state level is pretty different. Now, some states continue to publish their own official court decisions on their own. In addition to their state official court decisions, there's also a commercial publisher, Thomson West, who has for 200 years published court decisions, and they have divided the country into these geographical regions, and they publish appellate court decisions from these different states in their sets of geographical reporters, or what we call regional reporters. So for instance, in the Atlantic Reporter, which in our case abbreviation will be abbreviated as A, or A second, or A third if it's up that far, we have the cases from Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Maine, New Hampshire, on and on. Okay. As we scroll down this list here, you'll see that Wyoming, along with 14 or 15 other states, decisions are published in the Pacific Reporter. Okay. You'll notice also that those states are pretty much our neighboring states, and then a few that are a little more distant. But for the most part, it's going to be a geographical distribution of court decisions. And actually, because this division was set up more than 100 years ago, I think they never intended there would be that many states really that would come out of that area that is what they consider to be the Pacific area. So let's practice, because I think sometimes this helps us to clarify what we've been talking about. So in this instance, we have a case citation 241S 457. If you remember from yesterday, a case citation begins with a volume number, and then it continues with an abbreviation of whatever set contains the document, and then a page number. So our challenge really here is to figure out what the S period stands for, which court is making those court decisions. If we go back up to our chart and we scroll down among our abbreviations here, we find that S is an abbreviation for the Southern Reporter, and it contains decisions from Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So I'm going to guess that it's going to be Southern Reporter. That's the court that is determining these. Of course, Southern Reporter isn't a court. It's a publication that publishes these decisions. And we don't know at this point whether the case comes from Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, or Mississippi. This site is in fact incomplete according to a true Blue Book citation. A true citation would include in parentheses the state and the date of the decision. I left that out because a lot of times people don't bring that information to you when they're bringing a case citation. So a lot of times you don't have that information. By looking at it though, we can at least determine a few elements about it, and that is that it's going to come from one of these courts here. The next one I think is kind of a no-brainer, 161 U.S. 99. That's clearly a decision that comes from the United States Supreme Court. It's published in the United States Reports, and it's available to us from volume 161 of the United States Reports, page 99. The 31's a little bit of a question. It's got an F second, and I don't expect anybody to remember, unless they've had some experience with it, which federal court that comes from. So I thought maybe if I can get us back to that screen, we can quickly take a look at where our abbreviations are, and that's actually going to be a reference to the Federal Reporter. So that's going to be one of our circuit courts of appeal. Right now we don't know which one because the screen didn't tell us. We didn't have enough information to determine which court of appeal it is, but we know it comes from one of the federal appellate courts. A true Blue Book citation should provide for you the information which circuit and what the date is of that case. The last one I thought we'd just play with for a minute and see what information, now that we've gone through a couple of these, what information we know about this. We know that it's volume 691 of P second. If you remember offhand, P second is the Pacific Reporter second series, and that it's at page 357. We know that the Pacific Reporter publishes case decisions from about 15 states, many of them in the same region as our own state, Wyoming. For all we know from this could be a Wyoming decision. So we know that we're looking at a state court decision here, and we know that at the state level, trial court decisions are not published, only appellate court decisions are published, and therefore we can tell that much from it. It's an appeal, it's from a state in our geographic region, and so we're going to say that's Pacific Reporter, a state case coming from Wyoming or one of our surrounding states. You might also see something like this. A few years ago, the Wyoming Supreme Court determined that along with those regional citations, when you submit a document to the Supreme Court, they should include public domain citations. And people will sometimes only pick one of the citations to bring it forward if they have a question for you. The reason that we have provided both of these citations is that the Pacific Reporter citation is specific to that one publisher. And you can usually find it, those are widely accepted, and you can usually turn those up in most of your electronic searches using the Pacific Reporter citation. But this citation here is not dependent on any one system, and you should, in an electronic environment, be able to put this into any system and bring up the cases, the Wyoming case to which it refers. You'll notice that it begins with the year 1991 as Wyoming abbreviation, and then chronological numbering of decisions as they're released by the court. Okay. So if somebody brings it up to you, this was the 95th decision, or could have been the 95th decision out of the Wyoming Supreme Court. Just a point for your own recognition. I don't know if you'll ever be asked to choose the best cases. I don't know if there is any way to determine what the best cases are, but here are a few guidelines that you can think about if somebody comes up with this question to you. If you're dealing with a state issue, then your first and best choice is to look at Wyoming cases. So you're looking for something that's from Wyoming out of the Pacific Reporter, so abbreviation P, P2, or P3. Because our Wyoming courts are going to be bound by those decisions as long as the facts are similar. Lacking that, or in addition to that, there's not always Wyoming case law on issues that you're researching. So while you might have to go to other jurisdictions to find what they've done, or you might just not have enough in Wyoming, or they might not support the issue that you're looking for. So you can go outside of Wyoming to look at decisions from other states. The Wyoming Supreme Court, and I'm not speaking for them here, I'm just making an observation. They do tend to look to the cases in our neighboring states. Remember, they're not bound to follow those decisions, but they do tend to use those to some degree, and I think it's in part because, you know, we have a geographic and cultural similarity with our neighboring states. More rural, we have lower population, we have similar issues to the things that they're encountering, and so it does make sense to look at those decisions and see if they're similar to our situation and use those in helping to formulate a legal argument. Beyond that, you can certainly use decisions from distant states. They're especially helpful if the facts of the case are very similar to the facts of the case that you're pursuing, and especially if they're interpreting a statute, if the statute is similar to the Wyoming statute that you might also be asking the courts to interpret. So similarity in all cases is going to work in your favor. If there are broad differences, then the opposing argument will probably suggest that that particular reasoning shouldn't apply because the differences are too vast. So the farther you get away from the facts of your case, the more likely opposing side and the judges might find that particular legal issue doesn't hold any water. You're also very welcome to use federal cases. While I said they're not binding on our Wyoming courts, but they certainly carry a high level of persuasive authority, especially United States Supreme Court decisions. If you're looking for a federal level, then preferably you're looking for decisions out of the 10th Circuit, because of course the 10th Circuit is the court that has jurisdiction over Wyoming issues, and United States Supreme Court decisions, pretty obviously. You're finding cases, and again I'm going to talk about paper resources for a minute. I'm going to go a little more deeply into digests. Okay, Digests are, as I said before, are subject access to cases in the paper environment. I assume that if you're looking at cases or taking patrons to look at cases, you're looking at online tools and doing keyword searches, and that's great. At least you have resources to do that, so that's great. And those can be all that you need in many instances. But when we're trying to employ legal language that we're not familiar with, sometimes the words that we're hitting on are not necessarily the words that were employed in the decision, and so, as in all keyword searching environments, it's easy to miss some important things. What the digest does is it adds the human element, okay? You were using kidnapping in your keyword search, but the person who compiled the digest actually has put anything dealing with kidnapping and abduction all together under the same category, so that all of those same cases are going to show, because it's the same issue really. So they break down cases into their various legal issues in order to allow a searcher to bring up the issues individually. And by that I mean a case can have any number of legal issues. 10 is a good number. Could have fewer, could have a lot more, depending on how extensive a case it is. But we always kind of use, for fun and because it's something that everybody's familiar with, an instance of the Three Little Pigs. We have, assuming that this would ever go to court and be pursued in the court, you have issues of assault, negligence, property damage, and those are just, off the top of our head in terms of a simple little story, right? So those are 3 legal issues. This case, Wolf and Pig, would be found in 3 places within the digest. It'd be found under assault, under negligence, and under property damage. It would be referencing each one of those places, so that wherever you are, if you need to know about cases dealing with property damage in your jurisdiction, that's going to show up, because it's all dealing with those variety of issues. And then finally, the sets of digests usually correspond to the sets of reporters. So there's a Pacific reporter, and then there is a Pacific digest that provides access to the cases within the Pacific reporter. Just going to show you a quick example here, and then I'll stop talking about paper resources. But here's an example of a digest, finding cases in a digest. And I would suggest that if you've got people and they're not having success finding materials using a keyword search, and they really need to do a comprehensive search, you might suggest that they come to a law library so that they can get some other resources that might be helpful to them. So in this instance, it breaks the legal disciplines up into broad categories. In this case, we're looking at copyrights and intellectual property. And then it divides them out into key numbers. This is key number 66. And in this particular instance, we're dealing with the aspect of musical works within copyright. What we've got here is this particular case, 20th Century Music Corp v. Aiken, that has decided about the legal aspects, the musical aspects of copyright, that no license is required by the Copyright Act to sing a copyrighted lyric for one's own gratification. Excellent. If I want to read this case, I have a citation here that I have actually 3 citations that I could go and access the decision in order to read what it says. Let me just review the 3 citations here. This is obviously citation to the United States Supreme Court decision in the Supreme Court Reporter, volume 95, page 2040. It's giving me what we call a parallel cite, that is, it's also published in, there's another option, if I don't have the Supreme Court Reporter, I can go look at U.S. Reports, volume 422, page 155. Or, absent access to that, I can go look at volume 45, Lawyer's Edition 2nd, page 84. It's really all it's doing is providing me access in case I don't have one. I might possibly have access to one of the others. Down here then would be the next case, or the next holding, based on our issue of musical works in copyright. In this particular instance, I would have my next case cited here, because this is the holding of the court on this particular issue. In fact, it tells me id, which means the case most recently cited above. And so actually, in my example here, both of these holdings come from this same Aiken case. So, in terms of electronic access, I do want to go to the Wyoming State Law Library. They have a good website for searching Wyoming cases. I also want to talk for a minute about FindLaw and some of the other sites. FindLaw has a nice deep collection of United States Supreme Court decisions. Their collection goes back to 1893. It has a nice solid search feature for those decisions. It also has Federal Circuit Court decisions back to the mid-90s, along with, very substantial search feature. It has links to federal district courts, which will vary in terms of the depth of their coverage of their court decisions. It also has links to state materials, but I would not refer you to FindLaw for state materials. The links are not well kept, and they're old, and they don't link necessarily to the best resources at the state websites. So there are better resources for that, and one of those that I would refer you to actually is this Washlaw site, because while they just collect links, they maintain their page very well, and they have a nice collection of state material, and they link to the most useful sites, I think, on most of the state pages. I do want to look at Cornell for just a minute before we search in the Wyoming State Law Library, mostly because something in specific that I want to show you here. I'm going to go into federal law and then down to the Federal Courts of Appeals. And you'll notice that you can search the circuit courts individually at this website here. And if you're only interested, for example, in the 10th Circuit, then that's fine. You can search in there. However, if you don't know what circuit might have produced a particular decision, or you just want to know what all the circuit court decisions are, then you can combine them in a search here. This is so much more effective than doing a broad Google search, because here you're specifically searching only the circuit court opinions on the internet. So that, I think, is a really valuable tool. In addition to that, we're linking at this page to many of the same federal courts as we're linking to on the FindLaw page. So other than that, I think that the FindLaw and Cornell websites are pretty comparable in terms of their access to federal court decisions. But let's go in and look at the Wyoming State Law Library's database of resources. And the first thing I'm going to do at this page, I'm going to select Wyoming. See, there's only a few states listed here now. And I have the option, if I have a case citation, to just type that in here. And I bring that up. It gives me the name of the case. I have here my public domain, my domain neutral site. I have my regional citation, and as I scroll down, I have the court decision here. Let's, though, say that I want to search something by subject or by keyword. So I'm going to go into here, and I have many options. I can use the regular search, which I'm using. I can use an advanced search. It has some very nice advanced search features. But I'm just going to do a simple search here. I'm going to look for paternity cases in Wyoming. And my results have 25 cases showing up here. As I scroll down to my cases, just my case name again, my public domain citation, my West Reporter citation, and I can look at that case by clicking on my link, and all of my term that I search is going to be highlighted. So, and I have 25 other results that I can go look at if I want to. We'll come back to that page in just a minute. First, though, I want to talk about, there's some screen captures from those searches that we performed. First, though, I want to talk about Shepherdizing it, and it's totally possible that you'll never be asked to citate any legal information, but I do want to talk about it in case it comes up for you, because we have access to a lot of this information on the resources that we're looking at. Shepardds is actually the resource that we use for legal citation. So to find out who is citing whom. And in the legal arena, this is particularly important. Because Shepardds is a proprietary term, other databases that come up and have the same functionality call it by different names. So in Westlaw, we're using the term key citing. In regular generic terms, we're calling it citating or citationizing. But that's the function of checking legal citations. Now, when courts write decisions, we have already talked about the fact that they use previous court decisions to guide them, and in fact, they're bound by some of their previous court decisions. Now, Shepherdizing is a way to check to see how the courts are using a case. Are they following the same reasoning as they had been following all along? Have the courts added to the interpretation of older cases based on newer facts? Think about it. You really cannot apply automobile laws to today's situation that actually were decided or put into effect at the turn of last century when we were still in the horse and buggy stage. And time changes things, so those issues have to be taken into account when dealing with cases, especially older cases. So we go ahead, we Shepherdize because courts can and do overturn or reverse decisions of older cases, in which case they're no longer valid. Let's say in your search you turned up a decision from the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and you were going to rely on that case to make your whole legal argument, or at least to make the basis of your legal argument that you support with other documentation. Well, it's very possible that if you don't research this further, that case could have been appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court could very well have said that that case decision out of the 10th Circuit was wrong. You can overturn that decision, or you can reverse the decision, or you can ask that there's a new trial. So there are a lot of ways that you can mess yourself up by relying on a specific authority and not checking to see what the result has been in other court decisions. And other courts can act on that case as well. And if there's negative treatment within your jurisdiction, it really is something you have to pay attention to. Some of the resources that we're looking at today are also going to identify for us other cases. And you're never going to formulate a legal argument using just one case. You're always going to want to use some cases. And I can't tell you how many because there's not a specific number that one uses, but you're going to want to have a variety of cases to support your legal argument. And Shepherdizing or citating is going to do this for us. It's going to give us a lot more cases dealing with the same legal issue. And Shepherdizing specifically, the tools that we're using won't, but Shepherdizing in the proprietary databases will also direct people to other secondary sources. And that's so let's go back to the example that we were using earlier. Going back to the Wyoming Supreme Court page, I hope, their database of case law. Back to my matter of paternity of JRW, okay? You'll note right here, you probably noticed this before already, that there's a link to citationize this particular case. When I click on this link, I'm going to get a list of all the other cases that have referenced my JRW case. And I can access them through their site or through their case name. Right here, it's going to tell me really how they treated it. They cited my case, JRW, and then they talked about it briefly. Mostly, these first cases are just citing it. But you see, all of these links are links to other cases that are talking about my JRW case. And as I scroll, and I'm going to do it quickly, we're going to encounter cases that have discussed JRW at more length. I would absolutely want to look at those cases because I don't know whether they're discussing it negatively or positively. Both of those things are going to might possibly affect how I use the JRW case in my legal argument. So this tool that the Wyoming State Law Library is keeping current for us is a very powerful tool and gives us a lot of options when we're doing our case law searching. There are examples of searching in there. Going back to FindLaw for a minute, because if we're going to talk about citating, we do have some other options, and one of those is going to be FindLaw for United States Supreme Court decisions. Getting to FindLaw here, perhaps, okay. I'm going to look into cases and codes, and I'm looking for Supreme Court decisions. And you'll notice I have some options for how to search. I can search party names or full text. I'm going to search full text, and I'm going to go ahead and put paternity in here because that's what we already used. I thought it was funny that I would have any federal cases dealing with paternity. In fact, I do get results. Here's one reason why, and hopefully these will come up. One reason why I don't care for FindLaw is that there's no context to the case. When it comes up, I have no idea what it's dealing with, except somewhere in there it's got paternity. I don't have the case name, I don't have a citation. I have to click on each of these links to find that information. But absent that, it still is, a database of results for me. I'm going to go into number 10 here, JEB. This is going to give me some options right up here. I can view the case or key cite. Key cite is a means of citating this case in Westlaw if I have a Westlaw password. If I don't have a Westlaw password, then I'm probably going to use these free sites right here. I can click on this link for cases citing this case at the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court level. That's going to turn up a couple results for me. I can click on the other link, and that's going to show me other cases in the federal circuit courts that have cited the same case. So this is what we call sort of the poor man's Shepardds. It doesn't give us all the bells and whistles, but it does give us the functionality, except that you're relying a lot more on your own assessment of these cases. You can always put a search in FindLaw for a case citation. Say you found a case you like and you put it in here into a search for cases in FindLaw, and it'll come up not only with your case but with other cases, and that's because those other cases are citing yours. So that's another way to do some citating on your own when you're visiting these sites. It's still better than just doing a regular Google search, because Google searches are sort of hard to control where they're going and what your results are going to be. Okay. Moving away from citating and the importance of that aspect, I'm looking at Wyoming court rules. Now, Wyoming court rules are written by the courts. They're usually adopted by the legislature, and in our case, and in the case of many statutes, they are available through the Wyoming statutes annotated, the paper set, and also through an online environment. And I want to briefly go to the court rules website right here so that you can take a look at it. All right, so let's go take a look at the court rules website. If you have anybody who is litigating with the courts, whether it's a civil issue or a criminal issue, you're going to want to take a look at the court rules with them. Those are going to be of vital importance to anybody who's dealing with the court. And I want to just take a look at these for just a minute. I'm not actually going to look at the rules of court, but I want to show you that they're here. Wyoming, you have the rules for the Supreme Court of Wyoming, but we also want to keep in mind that the Supreme Court of Wyoming is an appellate court, so if somebody is doing an appeal, they're probably going to want to look at the appellate procedure, civil procedure, there's criminal procedure here, and as I showed you yesterday when we talked about forms, they also have forms available, or at least sample forms that you can cut and paste into your own document and fill in the blanks sort of for those kinds of things. So the court rules are going to be a really important tool. I used to tell people it's like the top of the box of Monopoly game, because you have to know how to deal with the court, and most of us don't know the procedures for doing that, and this is one of the best tools for directing people for that. And it's going to be something that you're going to put your hands on an awful lot if you're dealing with people who are proceeding in the courts. I also listed federal court rules here because, like the Wyoming court rules, they're adopted into the sets of the federal statutes that we're going to talk about tomorrow, both the USC United States Code annotated from the United States Code Service that we'll look at a little bit tomorrow. They're also available from the individual court websites in almost all instances. I have a link here to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals because I thought it might be one that people tend to use, but we also should have provided perhaps a link to the bankruptcy website, because that's actually something that we do get a lot of people walking in the door looking for those kinds of things, how to proceed with an action in the bankruptcy courts. So let's just quickly review. We talked about our court system, the difference between trial courts and appellate courts. We talked about decisions and that they're published in reporters and how we can access them in online resources. We talked about case citations, more about this yesterday, but case citations that include a volume, a title abbreviation, and a page number. We didn't really talk about finding that abbreviation aside from the typical case reporter sites that we looked at today. But yesterday when we talked about reading citations, legal citations just in general, I provided a couple of resources that would help you if you came up against an abbreviation that you didn't recognize. So I'll refer you back to that. We talked about wanting to citate or Sheparddize the cases that you found to determine that there's still good law, and the fact that court rules exist for the court for those people who are going to initiate a procedure through the court system. And that's a lot for one day. I want to thank you for sticking with me and hope that we see you at tomorrow's session.
Great. Thank you very much, Deb. It doesn't look like we've had any questions coming in through during this program, so we'll go ahead and conclude. When I do send out that archive, I will send Deborah's contact information. You can find it here, dperson@uyo.edu. So if any questions come up after the session, you can certainly contact her on that. So with that, we will go ahead and conclude for today, and tomorrow's session is on statutes and regulations. Thank you very much, Deb.
Thank you.